So I wanted to introduce all of you to Rebecca MacKinnon, who is here to talk about her new book, Consent of the Networked. Rebecca is currently a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and also a co-founder of Global Voices, which is a citizen journalism network. And she also had a stint at the Berkman Center at Harvard. But before that, Rebecca was a foreign correspondent for CNN in China and Japan, and has an incredibly impressive career. She also speaks fluent Mandarin. Rebecca is also on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Global Network Initiative, of which Google is also a founding member. So she's here to talk about her book, which I have to urge all of you to read because I think it's the book I wish I had written. It's an incredibly thoughtful take on the overall state of internet freedom around the world and what roles that governments and companies and citizens play in shaping that future. So please give a warm welcome to Rebecca.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And you know, it's funny, when I started planning to write the book and then started writing the book, it was before the Arab Spring happened. So, and then as the Arab Spring was happening in January and February, I was kind of realizing I had to kind of reframe the book slightly based on what had happened. But it was also an incredible opportunity to really show in a very current and pressing way why these issues matter. And I guess Wael Ghonim came here recently, or he's coming. He came 2 days ago. And in the beginning of the book, I talk about, you know, the internet and social media obviously played some role in the Arab Spring. There's still a lot of debate about how big a role, et cetera, and people are going to be arguing about that for a long time. And Wael Ghonim, you know, famously said to CNN right after Mubarak stepped down, if you want to liberate a society, just give them the internet. And it's turning out to be a little more complicated than that, especially in Egypt, as they're really struggling to actually institute a democracy, despite, you know, having used the internet to say no to a nasty regime. How do you then use the internet to build a robust and functional democracy is a much bigger question, not only in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, where now that they've got a democratically elected constituent assembly that's writing a new constitution, they're having arguments about what should the role of censorship and surveillance be in a democratic society. And actually, some censorship in Tunisia has been reinstated for, you know, kind of, moral, ethical reasons. You know, people in a conservative Islamic society don't want their children looking at porn. And so how do you decide what the mechanism should be, and how do you prevent them from getting abused in a way that kind of takes you at least some steps back to where you came from and away from where you're trying to go as a democracy. And, you know, unlike a general audience, you guys have already, of course, think a lot about these issues. But, you know, increasingly as citizens, no matter whether we're Tunisians or Americans or French people or whatever, our relationship with government, our political lives are sort of mediated through the collection of technologies that and services and platforms that make up the internet. And so what my book is really about is not the question of, does the internet help the good guys more than the bad guys, or is it, you know, making us stupid, or is it used more for good or more for evil, but how do we ensure that the internet evolves in a way that best serves the rights and interests of citizens? And how do we make sure that the internet moves in a manner, evolves in a manner that is compatible with democracy here in the United States and compatible with the democratic aspirations of people around the world, which many people continue to risk their lives for every day. And of course, as a company, how does one support that while still being a profitable business is of course a challenging question. And I deal in the book quite a bit about kind of a change in the nature of sovereignty and power. And so in the physical world, of course, we have sovereign governments running countries. And if you're lucky, you're in a democracy where you actually vote for your leaders and you can vote them out of office if they're really awful, or at least in theory. You can, there might be some way to hold the government accountable. But that also the laws being passed by the government are affecting the citizens in that country, right? But now you have a situation, and we saw this with SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, and PIPA, the Senate version, where you have a law passed by Congress, which is elected by Americans, which potentially, it fortunately wasn't passed, but could potentially have affected the rights and freedoms of internet users all over the world who didn't vote for these people and have no way of holding them accountable, and who don't really necessarily care whether Indonesians are hurt by the law they pass, because they really only care, frankly, about their own constituents. I mean, there may be some who care, but ultimately their jobs do not depend on whether or not they're affecting the rights of people in Indonesia or Brazil or elsewhere. So that's kind of a sovereignty mismatch that's going on that has been exacerbated by the internet in terms of being able to hold state power accountable against abuse of people who use the internet. The mechanisms of nation-state democracy, even when they are working perfectly, don't really answer that question for us. And then, of course, you have the overlapping private sovereignties of companies. And I love this map. This is the latest version of the world map of social networks, and everything blue on this map is countries where Facebook is the most popular social network. As we saw in the Arab Spring and with the work of Wael Ghonim and others, that people used this globally interconnected network called Facebook, this platform, to challenge the sovereignty and legitimacy of their government in a way that was very exciting. But you also have the companies making decisions that may or may not always be compatible with the rights and interests of their users. So for instance, to continue on with the Facebook example, I talk about lots of companies, including Google in the book, but to continue on with the Facebook example, Facebook's privacy policies, they may work in certain contexts, but if you change the privacy policies suddenly and expose people's friends' networks, what does that mean for an Iranian activist who doesn't want their friends to go to jail for being associated with them? And to what extent have the people at the company thinking about the product and trying to make it profitable considered some of the life and death consequences of their choices? And so it's kind of both negative and positive. And then, of course, the big red there is China, with Facebook being blocked. And of course, no need to tell the story of Google's experience in China, where Baidu is now the dominant search engine, and kind of is solidified because of what's happened recently. But also in Russia, you have Russian social networks are the predominant networks at the moment, and there have been some troubling things going on despite kind of the protests and hopeful things happening. There are some real questions about the relationship between the Russian government and the social networking companies, and the extent to which the Russian security services are accessing information in a manner that is not helpful to the democracy movement there, just to put it mildly. So you've got, again, this question of how do you hold internet companies accountable to users' interests, and then how does the kind of the private governance that's going on overlap with the governance that's happening, that's being conducted by nation states, and then how that plays out both within countries and globally. So I use a phrase which Bob Borstein doesn't like very much, but we still speak anyway, the sovereigns of cyberspace, and how, yes, companies, oops, I better silence my phone. Companies cannot tax people and they cannot put them in jail. One can carry the analogy too far, but large global internet companies and platforms are playing a kind of governance function because they are having an impact on what people can and cannot know, how they organize in real life, how their identities are manifested in their communities, which has a lot of real life implications and ultimately can have a lot of political implications and implications for people's freedoms. And this whole question of to what extent are these sort of, benevolent kings or kings that claim to be benevolent, and is that enough? Is that acceptable enough in this world today when we rejected the divine right of kings some time ago in real life? And just to kind of reinforce the sovereignty problems that I was talking about, again, the internet primarily comprised of corporate platforms and services and so on. There's obviously some non-profit and decentralized non-corporate things going on as well, but most citizens, their relationship with their government is mediated through these platforms and services that are owned and operated by the private sector in different ways. And so in kind of a standard democratic kind of setup, within a democracy, ideally what happens is that we vote for our elected representatives. And then if a company is doing something that hurts us, let's say that, the milk has chemicals in it that's creating disease, or a company is employing 10-year-olds or something like that, the government then goes and regulates the company. And that kind of serves the interest and kind of holds everybody accountable, because the accountability is going through the elected democratic government. That's the ideal. It never works out perfectly, but that's the ideal. And it's kind of basically, in the pre-internet age, kind of made sense and sort of worked as much as it could, as any human system ever works. But, we have a number of problems. One is that increasingly you have companies, and, with SOPA and PIPA, that was a very clear thing, the extent to which corporations influence legislation, and that may or may not take into account the rights and interests of a lot of other stakeholders. And so in that case, and then also you have a situation where companies, particularly technology and information companies, internet companies, are also shaping kind of how we conduct our campaigns, how we conduct our activism, what we know, how we know it, who we know, what people know about us, and so on. So they're kind of shaping our lives as well. And so one of the things I raise in my book is, do we need to have citizens kind of taking their concerns more directly to the companies more often? Because one of the problems with regulation, you could just be calling for the government to regulate Google and everybody else more because, Google's not doing this, that, or the other properly. But there are a lot of problems with regulation. It tends to be ham-fisted. It may or may not solve the problem. It may be counterproductive. Are there ways to for companies to engage with their constituents, with their stakeholders, earlier in the process of innovation and product development, to anticipate problems that would end up enabling you to avoid people calling for you to get regulated in the first place? If you kind of talk to people about what their concerns are going to be, and the question about how you do that, and we've had some conversations more directly about we're in very early days about thinking about how a company might do that. You also have the problem, like I said before, of governments, passing laws and doing things that influence people who have no control over what they do, and a company in one country is influencing people around the world whose experiences they might not understand or really relate to in any way. And so then it almost becomes even more important that people around the world, since they can't do anything about what that government's doing, but they might be able to engage with the company that interfaces with that government. Can that company sometimes act as an advocate for users who are not from that country that is passing the laws? And that's also an interesting question to think about. So after I've shown that really excessively complicated graphic, I'm going to show a funny video from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which I think kind of outlines one of the core points of the book. So here we go.
Two-thirds majority in the case of be quiet. I order you to be quiet.
Order? Who does he think he is?
I'm your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You don't vote for kings.
did you become king, then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
Be quiet.
Oh, but you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
Shut up!
This is one of my favorite Monty Python clips of all time, and so I just love the fact that I can actually use it to illustrate a point in my book. But the point of it is that one reason why it's so funny is that it juxtaposes two completely different ways of thinking about power and sovereignty and the way in which governance happens. And the first way is the divine right of kings. And there was a point in time where everybody in the world was basically governed by some king, sultan, whatever, Khan, whatever it was. And most of these rulers were claiming divine authority, emperor, to rule their subjects. And it was assumed this was the only way to govern anything, and that's how power worked, and that's how the world was. And that evolved. We had political innovation or political evolution or whatever you want to call it. In modern times, it began in part with the Magna Carta, when the barons of England kind of decided that this divine right of kings thing was not working for them very well, and King John was a real jerk, and he needed to be bound by laws, and otherwise they weren't going to be loyal to him. And that kind of evolved over time to the concept several hundred years later with John Locke, and articulating the notion of consent of the governed, and that government that does not derive its mandate from the masses is illegitimate. And then it took a bit longer for a revolution here in the United States, in America, as it was called then, to happen, and for the first effort to actually implement consent of the governed in real life. And now, kind of globally, even countries that aren't democratic still claim that they are governing with the consent, and sometimes come up with really elaborate sham mechanisms to prove this, fake elections and all kinds of different things. And so consent of the governed, we're sort of now, I argue in the book, we're kind of at a new Magna Carta moment where consent of the governed based on the nation state is kind of the assumed way of how you organize power and how you hold power accountable. But we're starting to recognize that that's not working for us so well anymore for all the reasons I talked about earlier, that one nation state exercises power over technology, and then it has effects on people elsewhere, and they're not held accountable. And you have private corporations that may be well-meaning, but are making decisions that have all kinds of different effects, and that sometimes the constituents, users, find legitimate and good, and other times find to be quite illegitimate. And how do we build mechanisms that actually constrain the use of power across a globally networked world, across this global digital network, and how do you hold power accountable across a global digital network? And we don't have mechanisms to do that. The current sort of structure of politics and geopolitics and governance and business practices and corporate structures is not working for that. And we don't have a lot of answers. I don't have sort of Rebecca MacKinnon's solution for how to build consent of the network in some kind of grand scheme. I'm calling on people to figure it out. But the first step is recognizing that there's been a change and we need to work for it. And just kind of quickly, before I close, there's an analogy that I first heard from a professor at the University of Austin, Texas, named Rosenthal Alves, who talks about how the pre-internet age was an information desert. And so governance, accountability, sort of our whole way of organizing our reality and our knowledge about reality was based on scarcity and based on the management of scarce informational resources. And then suddenly the rain came with the internet, and we're now living in a rainforest. And the ways of organizing civilization that worked, well enough or made sense in the desert are not working in the rainforest so well. And we have all kinds of new organisms that have built up. And so how do we build a civilization in cyberspace that is respectful of the rights of all of its members, and that you can govern it, but it's governed in a manner that's fair for all of its members, and in which the abuse of power and force is constrained to an adequate degree, and we're not sure how to do that yet. Also in the book, I talk about the importance of the digital commons, and this is something that Google has been very supportive of in terms of open source software and open source communities and free content communities or content sharing communities, and all the people who are producing both standards as well as code as well as content on the web, who are doing so for reasons other than financial motive, and without this robust community, not only would we have no internet, but it would be much harder for civil society to do what they do today on the internet. And I co-founded this organization, Global Voices, which is, runs on WordPress, and there are a lot of activist communities around the world that would not be functioning online if it were not for open source, developers and communities that continue to make those products better. So the importance of the digital commons in sort of keeping global digital civil society and dissent and discourse alive being really important. And then just in closing, there are various experiments. There's ICANN is one experiment to deal with one specific set of issues in governing specific internet resources, related to domain names and matching them with IP addresses and coordinating that. And, there are a lot of problems with ICANN, but it's a multi-stakeholder model and is trying to kind of insist on remaining multi-stakeholder despite a lot of pressure from a lot of governments to basically hand over its functions to the United Nations, and the importance of bringing in civil society groups in addition to companies to kind of work out how the internet should be coordinated going forward being really important. And you're seeing more groups kind of coming up with bills of rights and declaring their rights and saying, look, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can actually apply to the internet and should, and here are guidelines for how governments and companies can take universal rights and apply them to both their lawmaking and their corporate operations. You have efforts like the Global Network Initiative that Google is a member of to bring companies together, commit to basic standards on free expression, privacy, and other aspects of human rights, and work proactively with civil society groups and socially responsible investors to try and anticipate problems and also kind of work together to figure out how do you respond to really difficult challenges, and how do you think through the human rights implications of your business in advance of problems emerging, and how do you address them, the problems when they do emerge. Google's transparency report, I think that all companies ought to be releasing something similar. Again, it's really important that citizens understand kind of how government power and corporate power over their information is interfacing, because I think it's where that intersection happens, where a lot of troubling things can take place. And so the extent to which companies can be transparent about what governments are demanding and how people's information is accessed and how it's used, I think is critically important. And another thing that Google's been doing a fair amount of is with Google Plus, for instance, there have been a number of executives who've been working very hard to kind of talk to user communities and talk to critics and get that feedback and try and improve on some of the problems that have come up. And we were having a conversation earlier about how to kind of systematize that more and really use conversations with stakeholders and communities to improve the product, anticipate problems, build trust. You're also, of course, seeing a lot, more and more company-targeted activism. I think it's a real trend that more and more people, activist groups that have been, up until recently, primarily targeting their activism to government, are going to be targeting internet companies more and more. And so that's an interesting trend to watch, and to figure out how to kind of interface with that. And of course, I think finally with the SOPA PIPA thing, voting publics are becoming more aware of how internet-related legislation is affecting them. I think people haven't been paying too much attention. I think they're starting to, and it's going to be very interesting to see if internet rights become more of a mainstream political issue, and how that affects our politics, and how that affects kind of the role that companies play in that political discussion in this country and in, around the democratic world. So with that, I end with my favorite picture from the Occupy Wall Street movement, with this guy who has a sign there, "Let's get our SHIT, let's figure this SHIT out together." The point being is, we're recognizing, I think we're at a point, it's not just when it comes to the internet, but when it comes to all kinds of issues in terms of the global economy, in terms of the way global governance works. A lot of things aren't working so well for a lot of people on the planet. And how do we work out solutions? And we need to figure this out together. Civil society, companies, how do we create a planet that's more sustainable, and that is the kind of society that we want to live in, not only sustainable in terms of environmentally or our resources, but also how do companies contribute to a society that we want politically, the kind of freedoms that we want, that we aspire to have, and how do we make sure that companies are part of this ecosystem, to ensuring that democracy is as robust and healthy as possible, and not inadvertently contributing actually to the weakening of democracy in different ways, and the extent to which it's important that companies be thinking about that as much as they're thinking about how am I contributing to a sustainable environment, or a healthy workforce, or whatever, all these other things that companies have come to think about, which they didn't think about at all 100 years ago. It wasn't considered the business of business, but now is. And so kind of privacy, human rights, freedom of expression is now kind of entering into, I think, very early days of people realizing that this is yet another part of being a sustainable business. So with that, thank you very much. I talked a little longer than I planned, but I hope it was interesting, and I look forward to your questions or comments or objections, or whatever it is.
Hi. So your rhetorical context seems to be that democracy is in some sense the natural terminal point of political development, and that American corporations are sort of the natural terminal point of economic development. But then you undermine yourself by going on to point out that the powers that are exerted by government are not well matched with the people who actually vote for them. There also seems to be a contradiction in the very basis that governments, maybe it is good for them to be democratic, but corporations are meritocratic, perhaps with some bizarre metrics. But how can one be right for government and the other be right for business? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if I analyze what you're saying as closely as I can from what I've heard today, why is the space of solutions so small? Why are we talking about governments and corporations when, in fact, it looks as if informed decision-making is really the problem that we're trying to solve? And at this point, I would like to say something nice about China, who at least seem to be trying to find that solution, even if they haven't got there yet and may not get there for a long time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I lived in China for 9 years, and so that's definitely something one could talk about for a long time, about the intentions of the government and to what extent. Obviously, China's a much more complex place than is kind of discussed, I think, in a lot of the media. But I guess this question about democracy, when I talk about democracy as an ideal, and I guess that's part of the problem of giving a short talk, I mean sort of democracy with a small d, as opposed to democracy as the United States currently practices it institutionally. And I'm not sure, maybe there's a better system of holding power in check. I just don't know what it is. I started my academic career studying the origins of the Chinese and Russian revolutions and the origins of Marxism and sort of communist revolutions. And so therefore, I must admit, I'm deeply suspicious of utopian philosophies that, kind of seek to kind of provide a total solution, or that are based on the idea that human nature can change. It's just everything I've studied and everything I've experienced personally, having lived in China for a very long time and also spent a little time in Russia and having just studied kind of what went on. And, my parents actually wrote a book about a communist journalist in the 30s and 40s who, was involved with several communist movements at the time. And so I guess I've been exposed a lot to how idealist the socialist movements were at the turn of the last century, and how badly wrong they went, and how horribly they were abused by evil people. And so I guess where I end up philosophically is that democracy kind of as an ideal is a horribly imperfect thing. But I haven't come across anything, I tend to buy into the notion that we have to assume in our system of government, any system of government, that people are going to abuse power, and that, people are going to act in their own self-interest, and that you need to create a system that kind of sets up checks and constraints, and that as human beings, that's the best we're ever going to be able to hope for. Unless human nature changes, which I'm not counting on, and which I think basing a system of a political movement on is dangerous. So, I'd love to hear other ideas about other political systems that might work better, but I'm deeply suspicious of anything I've heard so far that isn't, small d democratic and kind of small l liberal. And that's just where I come from philosophically. And I guess then, again, with corporations, having spent time in the communist world, I do think that capitalism needs to survive. It needs to change. It needs to evolve. It's not currently, in the way it's practiced in many forms, healthy. But again, what are the alternatives? State-run economies. I just know too many people who have suffered under that kind of system. So I guess my hope is that we can find a way to evolve private enterprise in a manner that's sustainable, and evolve small d democracy in a manner that works in a globally networked world. And it is messy, and I guess that's just sort of the nature of where we are now, that it does seem contradictory. Because the ideologies that have kind of been the norm aren't necessarily producing the best results, yet all the ideological and kind of systemic alternatives that I know of, as they've been practiced to date, have resulted in much greater evil, in my opinion. And China, to the extent that it is going to work out, I think is moving away from those ideologies and those systems rather than re-embracing them. So, yeah, but it's tough. And I really appreciate the points you made, because, had I been a really rigorous political scientist and theorist rather than writing a more kind of populist general book, I think I would have quickly gotten twisted around on the theory. So, you're absolutely right to point that out. Mm-hmm.
Hi. Thanks again for coming. So my question is really about the consent of the governed concept. Because I think all of us here, especially people involved in developing products, I wouldn't be surprised if people here feel that our users actually consent to use us way more than I as a citizen consent to almost anything my government does. I mean, on a daily basis, a user's consenting to use Google, for example. And so I guess I'm interested to tease out a little bit more. I think that there's something to it. I'm just interested to tease out a little bit more, like what is it? What is the thing that you're worried about that Google needs more consent for somehow?
Oh, that's a really good question. And there's obviously a lot of problems with democratic consent as practiced for exactly the reason you point out, that most people are not exercising their ability to reinforce consent or withdraw consent. They're just kind of, apathetic. And sort of the extent to which you're apathetic is the extent to which you get the government you deserve, I would argue. And it's absolutely true. People are clicking through to terms of service and so on. But then there are a lot of things that I think people are just kind of sticking with, even though they're uncomfortable and unhappy with them, because they're on this service and it's such a pain to leave. I hear this from people who use Facebook all the time. I need to be on Facebook because all my friends are there, or because I'm an environmental activist and running this campaign, I have to do it on Facebook. But, this, that, and the other thing deeply troubles me and I don't know what to do. You hear that a lot. So with the Google Plus thing, for instance, there were a lot of people who said, who are you to say that, so say there's an Iranian activist who has a persistent online identity, Vahid Online. It's obviously not his real name. And he got kicked off of Google Plus. And, the issue is, to what extent did this, and we've had conversations like this about this in private, but to what extent does this, he probably did click on some terms of service he didn't read, and, he doesn't have to use it. Nobody's forcing him to, but, if he's also been kicked off of Facebook and, everything else, would Google in the long run benefit from developing a product in a way that has more kind of proactive buy-in from its users, so that they feel that the policies that are being developed really kind of respect their rights and interests? And how you do that, of course, is, I think we're still in really early days of figuring that out. I kind of feel, and I certainly hope that the companies that figure that out more than their competitors, or faster than their competitors, are going to have a real advantage in terms of the trust and buy-in that they earn from people who use their products. I'm very much hoping that will be kind of part of the value that companies create, and a sort of innovation in a way. But yeah, because at the same time, taking a product development decision to a vote of your users is, that would be ludicrous, right? That's not, but then, then the issue is, and this kind of gets beyond the consent, or at least, majority consent question, because if you're, and, coming back to sort of physical governance, if you're trying to run a democracy in which unpopular minorities can also exist, or people with really niche, or, as we might say, long tail concerns, if you're trying to create a society in which those people can be heard and have the space to exist and aren't squeezed out, or living in fear, or whatever, completely marginalized, how do you structure that, and how do you provide the mechanisms for those people's rights to speak, to exist, to own property, to run a business, to publish, remain very protected, despite the fact that maybe the majority of people in that community might think that they're completely, illegitimate and should have no right to exist, and don't like them at all. But the extent to which a society kind of protects the right to exist and the right to thrive of its most kind of marginalized and vulnerable members, I think is important. And as we, and again, sort of overlapping it, things like Google on top of, our attempt to continue to have a democracy, when the public sphere is kind of engaged primarily through these spaces and political campaigns and activism and so on. How do you ensure that those people whose rights we want to be protected in real life have a place to exist in these digital spaces? And then how do you kind of consult with them and learn about their concerns and find a way to take their situation into account? And so that's that kind of goes beyond consent theory to other stuff. But I think as we're thinking about just how to be compatible with democracy, which may or may not have anything to do with running a profitable business, what needs to be taken into consideration.
So I wanted to ask you a question that is a little bit off the core of your book, which focuses on governments and internet software companies. I wanted to ask you about some of the developments of the last year that we've learned about in regards to surveillance by governments.
Yeah.
Blue Coat in Syria,
Yeah.
Cisco in China, and that New York Times story from a couple of weeks ago about Apple and the iPhone, which was a fascinating story, but to me really captured a conversation and a debate that has been going on that predates the internet.
Yeah.
It goes down to the whole question of sweatshops
Yeah.
and foreign workers and what the role of governments are in Western democracies that where companies are based and yet use the labor of companies that are in regimes that are less open.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, the Apple case, just to kind of start from there, is Apple is reviled within the socially responsible investment community, for exactly, the sweatshop reason. There's something called the Fair Labor Association that a lot of manufacturers have joined and have been members of for a long time. And, some companies like Gap kind of took a while to kind of turn around and recognize, the benefit of being part of these types of initiatives that kind of where they commit to basically be audited for their labor standards and to kind of be certified that they're not abusing workers. And Apple's been, I think they announced recently that they are going to join the FLA, but they've been really resistant for the most part to engage with the human rights community on labor standards. And it's one of, an extremely long list of troubling things about Apple, that one might compile. And then this question of sales of surveillance technology, I actually do deal with that in the book as well. Although some of the major news kind of came out after the book went into the publisher. But yeah, absolutely, that there are companies that are profiting directly, and knowingly from the, it's basically arms sales, to repressive regimes essentially. And this is one reason why this piece of legislation called the Global Online Freedom Act has been revived kind of in a new form in the past couple months. And it's geared more than it was in the past towards trying to constrain precisely this type of export and this type of business relationship. And the problem is, of course, it's hard because a lot of this technology is also used for legitimate security purposes or legitimate network management purposes. And you can market it one way for a very repressive purpose, and then you can also market it in another way. And so how exactly you regulate it is hard. But certainly, I mean, one actually interesting development is that, WebSense recently joined the GNI, and they're, a filtering software company. And they say, look, we're meant to help families, keep their children off of certain websites, or, kind of companies keep their employees from playing on Facebook all day when they're supposed to be working. We're not meant to be used as a tool of political repression. And so we want to kind of commit publicly to this notion that we don't want our software to be used for political repressive purposes, and we're going to work with investors and human rights activists to kind of prevent that from happening. And they just joined, so we're going to kind of have to see how that evolves. But I think it would be important for these companies who produce equipment and software that can be used, has this dual use function, to make really robust commitments about what their technology is intended for and what it's not, and to make commitments not to sell to regimes that obviously are going to use it in a particular way. And I think it would be, you may be able to regulate that to some extent, and I think the regulation is actually moving towards, SEC reporting and this kind of thing, so that investors will understand more whether this company is behaving responsibly. But also the socially responsible investment funds that are sort of gaining steam kind of across the board are starting to look more at these issues too. And Boston Common, which is one of these funds, they sold all their Cisco stock last year because they were so mad that Cisco wouldn't engage in dialogue with them about how their products were being used in China. And so I think we're going to start seeing more investor activism and more push to kind of require these types of companies to disclose who they're selling to, and to adopt policies, kind of know your customer, and that you have to kind of track where it's going and where it's being used, and sell and market it responsibly. But it's a tough and troubling issue. Yep, you had a...
Can I go around again?
Yeah, sure, why not?
So, taking a step beyond consent of the governed, I think we have to think about the informed consent of the governed.
Absolutely.
One of the things that, if I may wax political, the Republicans and the Taliban have in common is this clever idea that if you abolish science education and you abolish ethical education, then maybe people won't notice that we're saying something weird here. And
yeah, that is a problem.
here at on the corporate side, here at Google, we have a rather peculiar position that it's all very well to talk about the free market, but the notion of marketing undermines the free market. If you tell people what to buy and you don't give them good opinions, then they'll act on the bad opinions.
Yeah, and you manipulate them with kind of quasi...
Right. So as we've stepped from a sort of an informational desert to more of an informational blizzard, what do you think we can do structurally in society to promote truth over local political advantage?
That's a really, that is a subject of some other books by some really smart people I know, and is a huge matter of debate. And this whole question of to what extent do people care about facts, is very troubling. I completely agree. And as a former journalist, I'm often, one of the reasons I left CNN was because my managers wanted me to do less to inform the public than I was interested in doing, and I was told I should cover my region more like a tourist, and that my expertise was getting in the way of kinds of stories they wanted on prime time, and so on. Dumb myself down, basically. And so it's, when the reason you go into journalism is because you think it's really important for the public to be informed, and then your bosses say, well, we just want you to kind of not really inform them that much. It's really depressing. But my dear friend and colleague Ethan Zuckerman is working on a book that I think will come out in maybe a year or so, in dealing with what he calls the caring problem, which is a related problem, which is how do you get people to pay attention to issues that are important, and the importance of actually engineering for it, and structuring your systems around the recognition that people are probably going to have a bias towards not seeking out certain kinds of information, or a bias towards being susceptible to manipulation and so on. And so how do you engineer and also just kind of build online communities and platforms that try to kind of move the caring problem, it's kind of address the caring problem in the other direction. And, that's one of the things we try to do with Global Voices, is just kind of make it easier to access content from different countries, created by citizen journalists, that's going to give you a different point of view than what you're getting from the New York Times or CNN, or let alone Fox or whatever else, about what's happening in, whatever country it happens to be. But yeah, I think it requires constant effort, because I think, this is one of the problems, one of the many bugs in human nature, that's so troubling, which is that, we oftentimes are more governed by emotions and other things than we are by facts. And so how do we kind of say, okay, rather than what people should be, let's accept as a given, all the bugs in the way people are, and try and compensate for that in the way we build information products, news products, and so on. But it's really, really hard, given, particularly with for-profit news organizations being pushed to, if you're going to expand circulation and ratings, kind of ends up driving a lot of companies in the opposite direction. And so the extent to which we can kind of build information communities, and the extent to which Google can kind of help bridge some of these gaps, I think is vitally important. But anyway.
One of the things here at Google, most of the people here benefit tremendously from liberal democracy, for our lives. And we tend to build systems that we like. And unfortunately, some of those systems that we like, we can deploy them to the entire world instantaneously, with sometimes devastating results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like with Buzz or something.
I reread your articles there. So how do we temper that? And it's a difficult problem, because one person does have a tremendous amount of power nowadays.
Yeah.
And how do we check that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is I think the first step is recognizing this problem, and that's something that's really cool and works really well in the context of Mountain View, may play out really differently, in Syria. But there's actually, people you can consult with on that. You can talk to somebody who's sort of, part of that community. And you can, this is one reason, like with the Global Network Initiative, why we advocate that people run kind of human rights due diligence and kind of human rights assessments, when you're assessing a new product and how it works, you kind of game through, okay, this is really great for us here in Mountain View, but what if I am a dissident in Syria? And how does that play? What are all the worst case scenarios that might play out? Let's try and run those through, and figure out how that could play out, and talk to people who've got experience using the internet in Syria, and could, or how is that going to play out in China? There are people you can talk to, or how does that play out with people who are fleeing their abusive spouses, or people who don't want their sexual preference to be known by their bosses, or people who are maybe not quite so far from home. But I think the first step is just recognizing that you can't know on your own. It's the humility. It's just, I can't know on my own exactly how this product is going to play out around the world amongst people whose experience is so different from my own. But the good news is that there are people out there who want to help you think that through, before you roll out the product, and that you can call upon them. And so organizations like the Global Network Initiative, which Google joined, that's kind of one interface where a company can go to seek out the people you need to consult with. to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a really important step with Google recognizing that, you know, Google has a lot of geniuses, but you know, you can't anticipate everything. And just having that kind of humility is really important.
Just want to thank you for coming and talking with us.
Thank you. It's a great conversation.